human beings are very unique in the animal world because of our language. And our language gives us so many advantages over other animals when it comes to cooperative survival. And it's something that people tend to forget that really our brains are made for cooperation. And that means that to some degree, conformity and fitting in is pre-programmed into our brains with some very mild variations throughout the neurology of people. We want to cooperate, we want to conform, we want to be accepted, because that had to do with individuals surviving in society, and it had to do with society surviving in hostile areas, hostile territories. An example of the advantage of communication the way we do it is, a pack of wolves goes out hunting together. They're all going to sort of follow each other, and they might follow their sense of smell and that kind of thing. But humans can go, hey, I've had a whole lot of luck just a little bit south of here lately. I think we should check that out first. And then somebody else could say, yeah, but with the flood, we might actually want to be looking southeast. Okay, good idea, right? So, much more exacting communication saves time, saves all kinds of effort, and keeps us going. Before the written word, it was important to tell stories. Storytelling became the fabric of culture as soon as language became precise enough to communicate ideas about things that are not happening in front of your face. Which is a big cognitive leap. Thinking about things that are not happening, pretty cool. It's not generally something that happens in the animal world, so far as we know. But humans have this unique ability to think about stuff that's not happening and to draw conclusions based on stories about why things happen. Essentially, there are three kinds of story. One is a story about how things work. We see examples of stories about how things work in our very oldest known stories because they're mythology. They explain to us why people are how they got here, what the purpose is. And you look as far back as you can, Gilgamesh was a story that really was about humans and animals separating paths. And we see that same story repeated in lots of different ways over lots of different centuries as community by community, people began making a distinction between themselves and their environment in such a way as to sort of separate us and place us above it, but still have this sort of longing for it. For example, the Greek gods killed off the Titans. The Titans were essentially natural phenomenon. Each Titan named after a really important thing that makes the world happen. Time, mountains, oceans, waterfalls, tornadoes, etc. And the gods were more like the personalities or character traits coming forward out of these titans. And this relationship is so complex. And you can still look back at mythology, and in this case, Mycenaean mythology, and see all of these human traits and human struggles. It's still relevant today. That's why there's still operas and stories and whatnot that go back to these, because we don't need to know the exact mythos of that culture to understand the impact of what's going on, because people are people. And in most mythology, the gods or characters are made after basic human impulses. So they seem very, timeless in that sense. And of course, you can march up through time, and all of the stories that are still with us that are rather old have that in common. It's fascinating to me that you can teach somebody these days how to make an engine, say, or how to program a computer, but they can still be moved by the influences that happen to a character in Shakespeare, because there's still a whole emotional reality that is unchanged between then and now. So the first story is how things work. essentially mythology that gave these guideposts to people so that they needn't wonder, needn't spend their time too much deciphering exactly what all of this is, how it all works. The second story is a story about the way things are. And this is a news story, essentially. A story that's nonfiction, a story about something that literally did happen. Sometimes augmented, sometimes not. But it's very important in human culture to have stories about how things are in a literal sense. The stories about the way things work are fictional. The story about how things are nonfiction. And we tend to look at these things from certain angles when we are enmeshed in a culture so that our narratives can make our existence seem absolutely essential to the march of time, inevitable. So it's easy to look back at, the traditional ways in which American history is taught and uphold these notions of patriarchy and supremacy and whatnot and see, well, things were always going to be this way because that's the way the story was always told. It changes little by little, but essentially self-confirming stories within a culture. Very rare to have the dominant stories be about, like, what a fucked up thing it is that our culture is how it is. In general, they show things in a positive light. They show things that go against the culture in a negative light. And again, there is no single human act that has gone against every single culture. But these stories of how things are and the way that they're told can help us understand our expectations, can help us understand what is okay and what's not okay within our culture, can help us understand our place in this culture that is deemed inevitable by these stories, that shows us a way of being. And the last story are stories of action. And the stories of action essentially are saying that, if this is how things work and that's how things are, what actions do we take? What's the desirable goal for a person? Now, these can be fiction or nonfiction, but essentially they're guiding stories that are supposed to be pointing you towards the future. Instead of how we got here, instead of what things are, it's what you're going to do from here. Stories of action, stories that guide us this way, will piece together parts of these other stories and push you forward. So, for example, the American Dream is a great story of action. You're supposed to work really hard. You're supposed to mortgage your present because the future is going to be a whole hell of a lot better than it is right now. Scrimp and save. Live in a crappy place so that you can save up money to buy a nice place, and won't that be wonderful and rewarding? And of course, we have no control over what the future will be. We like to feel like we do. And these stories of action give us that sense of control. So really, the quintessential aspect of being human is the ability to tell and understand stories. To understand stories in a way that creates the fabric of a society. This is big. This is huge. And those stories may come in the form of artwork, may come in the form of hieroglyphs, may come in the form of monuments, may come in the form of music, may come in the form of pottery, mosaics, architecture. All of these things are really important elements of these stories. But when the particular words are given to them, and when these stories are written down, and when these stories are told orally, before the words were written, those particulars become the fabric on which you can base your entire society's existence. You teach the lessons that the older generation has learned. You teach the actions that bring prosperity. You teach the strategies that lead to a happy life. They don't always have to be right, but they have to be cohesive. Because cohesion will keep the power structure how it is, will keep things going the way they are, will maintain the status quo as much as possible. Cohesion is very important to these stories. So when you think about the role of television here, it's more powerful than anything that's come before it. There have been so many attempts to create a society based on unified storytelling that have never really reached everyone before. So you have storytelling. This could reach the number of people within that tribe, 30 or so. The children especially needed these stories so they knew how to behave when they were older, so they knew their expectations, so they knew how to uphold the fabric of the civilization. And then you take it a step further, and you might have stories that are happening within temples, within churches, within religions, within traditions that reach a far broader audience, but are still open for interpretation, open for taking things a little bit differently here or there. And that was really important because you wanted local places, local people to be able to add their flavor. When you go from village to village, society to society, they didn't all worship the same god. They might have variations of each other or whatnot. But the deities were separate, and certain ones were valued in this village because of the nearby river, and certain ones were valued in this village because of the prominent hunting or whatever. And they would bleed into each other, and it got to a point where, we had much more unified, organized religions, but even then there's schisms, even then there's corruption, even then there's all sorts of things that make it where these unified stories are very general when we speak broadly. Yeah, you can get a church full of people listening to the same story, and that's bigger than the tribe full of people sitting around a fire. But it's still just a church full of people. And as that story progresses and moves around, it changes, takes on some of the local flavor. So in the next church, it's told a little bit differently. Big, giant game of telephone. Some things become like so codified, and we've talked about this before, that eventually the stories get built upon by other storytellers in a way that is confirming, like fan fiction, but also carries with it the flavor of today rather than the flavor of then. So, for example, Paradise Lost has a big emphasis on choice and romance that wasn't really in the Bible telling, or wasn't really in the stories, the mythos from which the whole Adam and Eve and Lilith thing came to be before then. In the United States, we had this massive attempt to tell a collective story to all of its citizens, because all of these people in the United States post-Revolutionary War were of different cultures, different values, different religions. To them, they were all very different. And, with these days, we don't see French culture and German culture as different in the United States as we do, say, English culture and Chinese culture. But at that time, that was diverse, man. That was wildly diverse, having different Europeans together at last, All this infighting that was going to happen between all these, the Italians versus the Irish or whatever. They wanted this to reduce. They wanted people to see themselves as Americans, no longer as products of the old world and products of their ethnicity, but products of the land where they are. And this necessitated the compulsory nature of schooling. That schools would tell everybody the same story. So this new generation of people coming up would have in their minds the same story of who they are, built out of freedom from tyranny, freedom of self-government, freedom of democracy that didn't exist in the old world. And it didn't matter that this wasn't exactly true in any way. What mattered was that it was a unified story, so that you would have it being taught to other people from different walks of life all over these 13 states and then 14 states, etc., that were going to be able to inform this new generation of people about who they are in a way that would be unifying. That was big, but still, you have local flavor, local curriculum, local needs happening, local moralities, the competing morality of slave states and not slave states, the competing morality of rich people and poor people. All of this still kept schisms happening throughout the school system. no matter what the attempts were to make things be more uniform. Marching up through time, eventually we have stuff like radio. Radio had a really big influence. People sitting around at the same times from coast to coast, listening to the same storyteller tell something. That's big. Really big. You know, when FDR has his fireside chats and everybody across the United States is listening, and everybody has this sort of unified concern, or at least this story of unified concern. It's very smearing those lines between culture, smearing those lines between communities. And that's the idea. That's the idea because change is threatening to the power structure, and because every generation that comes up and can confirm the stories from yesteryear, it confirms your own existence. It's like a mass sort of cognitive dissonance, perpetuating itself. Movies, of course, were pretty big, but movies still had a very classicist ring to them. You know, movies were still not affordable to everybody and wouldn't show up in every town and everything, but they were very influential. We started changing a lot of our behaviors because of movies. For example, in the 1920s, movies started getting big enough that it influenced our hygiene. It used to be that people didn't wash their hair very often. That washing your hair was something to be done either when there was infestation or when it was smelling pretty bad, or on occasion. Before 1920, you'd have people washing their hair every month, every 2 months, something like that. And women, of course, had to have long hair, and men had to have short hair because that was what you do. And this impacted women much more, and they'd mostly wear their hair up. Mostly hairs were all updos or under hats and whatnot. The movies show up, and everybody has these beautiful, long, lustrous, clean hair. Everybody, like, you know, they're washing their hair before they shoot every day, for God's sake. And this was not an intended consequence, but it worked. All of a sudden, you had people coast to coast being like, I like to wear my hair that way too. I want to feel like I'm like that person. Taking care of their hair. You had people, you know, they didn't film people with bad teeth. Suddenly, dental hygiene became much more important than it used to be. Dental hygiene was no longer about pain and when it was time to pull, but keeping them up became much more important. There's a lot of psychology that went into that in toothpaste, and it's a whole lot of fun. And I'm so tempted to take you on a tangent, but I'm maintaining the course. Maintaining it hard. So, movies displayed the power of this visual element. And the visual element is so much more than the auditory one could be. Yeah, we were telling stories. Yeah, we were reading books. Yeah, we were being taught things. But seeing something embeds it on the human mind in a wild way. Visual influence is so much more impactful than almost any other sensory input, which is really weird, but true. And so what we have is movie makers seeing, oh, there's some influence here. There's some cultural push happening depending on what we show. So eventually in the 1950s roll around and TVs start becoming a thing that's affordable. And they start showing up in homes across the country. And this became more and more within reach. TVs are one of those technologies that became cheaper as things went on, as things were manufactured, as parts became plentiful. And by the time the 1980s were here, there were more televisions than there were homes. You know, the average home had more than one television in it. And at this point, I think that we have something like more televisions than people. I know we hit that mark, and maybe that's gone down a little bit because of our emphasis on internet and smaller screens and whatnot. But we definitely breached that gap where we ended up having more television than people. And even in the poorest households, there are televisions. They're almost seen as a right. They're almost seen as a necessity. Then we have this reach into everybody's home. And this reach really blurs line. This reach crosses from the rich to the poor. This reach crosses from black to white, everything in between. Massively influential. And there was this huge push, because the 1950s were this height of the Cold War type mentality, where we had to see ourselves as this huge moral presence. This was the rebirth of evangelism, essentially, within the United States, that linked a sort of new version of Christianity with the morality of the American way in fascinating new ways. And it became really important to see ourselves as moral. And there was a lot about what was right and what was wrong, what could be on television and what couldn't. In the 1950s, the most plentiful show out there was the Western, and Westerns were almost always cowboys against Indians. And this really helped push that mythos that we had to take over this country, that we were the white hat good guys, and that this was always going to happen. And you had a couple movies or whatever that were vaguely apologist, but for the most part, it was just a sort of given. And the Western was just massive. They're cheap. You just get some horses. You film in New Mexico or out in the deserts in California, no problem. Doesn't matter that, these weren't really the places where cattle ranching and cattle drives were big. It matters that this is the story now. But one thing that really happened that's fascinating is something much like the whole phenomenon of washing hair. There was some awkwardness in the staging of things for television, that actors, when they weren't talking, are kind of standing there. And this looked unnatural because really, they had to have the fourth wall down. There had to be an audience watching them at the time. And they found that it was really hard to make it look natural, because in real life, we all sit around things. We talk to each other while sitting and looking at each other or looking somewhere else. And this all looked really weird on television. So much like stage plays, they had to get them to move around in a way that invited an audience to be watching them. And so the actors kind of had to have something to do when they weren't talking. And smoking became the thing. Now, smoking was bigger then than it is now. But what we saw is in the first couple years of televisions being in households, in the late 40s, early 50s, in the first few years, a massive increase of smokers. Something like 11 million additional smokers popping up within the first couple years of watching television. And the tobacco companies are on this, right? One of the big movers and shakers of American society from the time of the Revolution until now. These tobacco companies were on the ball, and they started paying studios to have people smoking. And you're watching people smoke, it's a visual message. It's a visual message of normalcy, much the same way that seeing people with clean hair and nice teeth is this visual message of hygiene that became infectious. This visual message of people smoking made you feel like you were smoking too. And this is because of mirror neurons, right? The main way that we sort of hardwire ourselves behavior-wise is watching other people do things and having these neurons in your brain light up that make you feel like you're doing it. This is why if you see somebody getting hurt in a sort of visceral way on television, you sort of feel like you feel it. We have those same behaviors. I remember for a while in college, most of the people I hung out with smoked, and I didn't, but I would somehow sort of latently picture myself smoking. Like that was something that I did, but I didn't. But it was easy to sort of see myself as smoking when I would picture a scene of us hanging out together, because everybody else I saw was. All of them had these decorative little things to do with their hands and moving them around and whatnot. And not being a smoker or a drinker, I kind of sat there and was awkward. Go me. But this absolute influence of smokers became a phenomenon for television. This became the biggest advertising market, of course. And you had this, again, this unification of peoples, unification of different socioeconomic groups, different ethnicities, all watching the same show. There were very few channels, very few shows. And even today, what gets on television is up to the decisions of about 100 individuals. About 100 individuals are making the decisions about what is and isn't on TV. And that has become so much of our culture. And they found that this can really change the ideas that people have. And so this became one of the reasons that in the 50s there was this huge push for morality. You may not be as familiar with the television shows of the 50s as I am. Some of them were great. And the ones who survived, of course, like anytime you look back and you say, man, movies were better back then, video games were better back then, it's important to remember that you're remembering the top 5 or 10%. That most movies, most TV shows, most video games, most songs don't last a decade, and you don't hear them ever again. But the top, 5% or so of mass media that survives seems better than the stuff today because it was the good stuff. And I'm referring to like The Honeymooners, Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy being the best of those, but even Leave It to Beaver is a good show, man, for real. But there was this huge thing with like Leave It to Beaver, Fathers Knows Best, where you were supposed to be watching the wholesome American life, the nuclear family, man, woman, daughter, son. The perfect little American family with their American car and their suburban house, wearing pearls to dinner, wearing your suit and tie as you come home and relax. All of these things modeled what the American life should look like, very much on purpose, because the idea was that this is prescriptive. They saw this now. They saw that this is prescriptive. They saw that what you show to people in mass becomes a prescription for behavior. This became really important. And we found that this even influences the way we see ourselves and the way we see our relations with other people than us. So, for example, in the 70s, there was this big push to try and have much more diversity in television because the whole civil rights thing happened. And then we wanted to confirm the existence of people who weren't white, upper middle class Americans. We wanted to be able to see them as people too, believe it or not. And you see a bunch of new shows that centered around those themes. And in the 80s, when the drug war was on, and television shows literally had to either have one episode every 6 months that gave the message to not do drugs, or they had to give up 2 minutes of commercial time every episode to show PSAs about not doing drugs. So this is why, if you're Gen X and you grew up seeing tonight on a very special episode of Different Strokes, or tonight on a very special episode of Saved by the Bell, they had these very special episodes that had this do not do drugs message because it saved them thousands and thousands of dollars. To do a crappy episode of Family Ties where Michael J. Fox uses speed to study for a test and then crashes and burns and learns the poignant lesson to not do drugs, that crappy episode wouldn't lose you too many viewers. But if you gave up 2 minutes of ad time every episode to PSAs, that's free. You're not getting sponsors paying for the show for 2 minutes. They weren't going to do that. So they had to have those elements. Again, because these elements that you show on television are prescriptive. Amazingly, in the early 2000s, there was a vote in California to ratify same-sex marriage. Oh, you know what? No, okay, I'm wrong. Same-sex marriage became a thing in California because it wasn't addressed in any of the laws. And then there was a vote to make it where marriage was defined between a man and a woman. And this is California we're talking about. And there was a massive, massive ad campaign pushing people to vote to redefine marriage as between a man and a woman, and a man and a woman only. And mind-blowingly, this went over in California. Mind-blowingly, people were convinced that, oh yeah, we probably should do that because, gay people are more promiscuous and they're just trying to get tax benefits and blah, blah, blah. And our kids are going to learn about fairy tales with his two princes, and that's just wrong. Yeah, boomers, dude. Boomers were the major voters. Gen X, we were small. even though we were voting, we were small. We didn't have the millennials at our back yet. So this went over, and people in Hollywood were like, well, that's fucked up. And they started showing more television shows with gay characters. They made openly gay characters mainstream in television. In the 90s, we saw just a few openly gay characters pop up here and there, and it was always a big deal. You know, oh, Ellen's gay, oh my God, oh, Murphy Brown, what the hell? And so in the early 2000s, there became, Will and Grace. There became, casually gay characters in most sitcoms. And this changed attitudes towards homosexuality to the point where they outvoted this the very next election cycle. Okay, so this influence can be used for good or it can be used for conformity. And it's good to know this. But it's heavy to know that the will of people, the will of people to vote on rights, to decide what rights are given and taken away. Voting to take away rights is a 21st century thing. Can rest on the shoulders of what plot lines and characters are on silly little Thursday night primetime television. That's big. So next week, we're going to talk about exactly what we were learning for the last 50 years of the 20th century and the first 10 years of the 21st, based on the primary version of television that people were seeing.